All right, welcome in everyone. It's time for Sports and Leisure's History Look Back for the week of August 3rd to August 9th. I'm Jeff Klein, and as always, I am joined by Clayton Hamilton, someone who always brings the heat. How's it going, Clayton? And how's summer in Vegas?
It is hotter than you could ever imagine. It did rain today, which was fantastic,
Wow.
but it is inside activities probably for the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, speaking of hot, we have a hot show lined up. We have a couple pretty famous MLB players we're going to talk about. We got a favorite of mine from the NFL. We got some international soccer, women's Olympic events, NASCAR, so kind of covering a lot of everything out there. Um, and with NASCAR, we're going to talk about racing convertibles. Nothing cooler than racing convertibles. So that's a pretty fun one to get into. But before we start, I just wanted to see what you're watching. There's always a lot going on. I did want to ask you about. I know you were watching it, and I caught this match as well. The Sabalenka getting bounced by Alexandrova in tennis. Did you watch that match?
I did watch that match, and it just seems like all summer, and even in the spring, that Sabalenka just has these little 3 game lapses in the middle of sets when she used to just turn the gas on and would roll over these other ladies she was playing, and now she's giving away breaks and
Yeah.
she's giving away service games, and it's just it's just enough to get beat, which is what Alexandrova did.
Yeah, it was pretty disappointing. And it was sort of shocking because it's not like Alexandrova played phenomenal tennis. She looked just as bad. It was just Sabalenka just didn't seem right at all. And I imagine it's just a blip, like you said. Occasionally she'll go through these ruts, but pretty shocking. Someone Sabalenka, I love watching her. It's just one of my favorite women's tennis players, and yeah, it was just really surprising.
It was, and I thought, you know what, this I thought this was a blip in the spring, but
Yeah,
it's been a blip all summer, Jeff.
yeah,
So, I don't know what's going on with her, but it just seems like there's these lapses of concentration that
yeah,
happen in the middle
absolutely.
of sets that she's leading. I mean, she was up a break early. It was two love, and everything was
Yeah.
rolling along, and all of a sudden it was 3-2, and then she tried to fight back the whole first set and couldn't do it.
Yeah, and just when you think she's about to turn the corner, like she's sort of settled in and figured it out, she'd slide back into some of that really sloppy, unforced errors, a lot of bad play. So we'll see what happens with her. Anything else you've been watching?
I did watch the women's artistic gymnastics national championship. Hesley Rivera, the Olympian, we remember
Hmm.
her from Paris and her team gold medal. She went back to back and came back from in fourth place after day one, but she won last year. She wins again this year, and it was really good to see Sky Blakely back. Remember, she was almost guaranteed to be on that Olympic team in Hesley Rivera's spot until she
Yeah.
got hurt at the Olympic trials. But she came back. She completed the entire 2 day event, which is good. Finished a little bit down in the pack, but it was nice to see her back. And it was also nice to see Risa Sponda, who won the U.S. Cup. She came in fourth and sort of backed that up. There were a lot of people wondering whether or not she's a real contender, but she showed that she could put together 2 good performances in this competition and 2 good competitions back to back.
Yeah, it's a shame that people really only pay attention to gymnastics when the Olympics rolls around. It's or the sort of the lead up to the Olympics, but there's always phenomenal gymnastics. It doesn't you can't catch it as much on TV unless you're really looking for it. So, but great to hear. Appreciate that update.
And they're going to be going into a camp where they decide the World Championship team. So the World Championships will happen this year in October. So you will see some of these ladies. Also, Suni Lee said she was coming back. Jordan Childs and Simone Biles have said they're unsure whether or not they're going to. But Jade Carey, Hesley Rivera also in the mix for 2028. And you know what else I saw, Jeff? which was something that nobody really pays a whole bunch of attention to but once a year. And unfortunately, myself included, I do catch a little bit of it when I'm at the book from time to time because it is always on the TVs. But the Hambletonian was today the biggest harness race of the year. Think of it as the Breeders' Cup Classic meets the Kentucky Derby all in one day for harness racing. And Apex, with a photo finish, Jeff, in 1:49.2, the fastest Hambletonian in the history of the 101 runnings of the Hambletonian. So good day out at the Meadowlands in New Jersey.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, the Hambletonian. I think a lot of people probably wouldn't even know what the Hambletonian is. I bet 9 out of 10 podcast viewers might think you were referencing something related to Hamilton on Broadway. So, but great to get that update.
Yeah, it was a one heck of a race. If you like the sulkies, you like the chariots, as some people call them. But good race, fastest one ever.
You know, I feel like the chariot racing. You know, everyone knows horse racing, right? Mm-hmm. The traditional, Belmont and Kentucky Derby and all of that. But I feel like it's kind of like singles and doubles tennis. Like everyone watches singles, but not many people watch doubles unless you're really into the sport. Kind of feel like that with horse racing, right? Where you have the traditional kind of what everyone thinks of, with Secretariat and all.
Right. Yeah. You don't hear too many. I think maybe the most famous harness horse is probably Dan Patch, and that goes like all the way back into the 20s or earlier, even maybe in the late 1800s. But I don't even know when Dan Patch ran, but that's the only one that I can think of off the top of my head. And I know that was, like I said, a real long time ago that Dan Patch was out running. But it's always fun if you get a chance to go to the races or, you're tooling across the book in fabulous Las Vegas. Stop and watch because they are always on in the horse area of the book.
All right, well, on that note, we're going to move on and get to our history. But before we do that, just want to remind everyone out there to follow us on all the socials. We're at Sports History SL. That's Sports History, the letter S, and the letter L for Sports and Leisure. And we're on Blue Sky, Instagram, Substack, X, and YouTube. And then on Facebook, you can find us at Sports and Leisure. I got a lot of history posts happening there. We're posting some videos, some clips. So if you don't get a chance to always watch all of our podcasts, we're starting to put more and more of the clips from some great discussion points that we bring up during our weekly episodes. So check it out. Okay, well, let's move on. And we got our first one. We're going to talk about some baseball. And that was on August 8th. We posted about Carlton Fisk, who, while he was with the White Sox in 1990, he hit his 327th home run. It tied him with Johnny Bench for the most long balls by a catcher in baseball history. He would pass Bench about a week and a half later and establish a new record, and eventually Mike Piazza would pass Carlton Fisk. But most people remember Carlton Fisk for his 1975 Game 6 World Series home run, where he hit a walk-off with the arms waving to try to will the ball to stay fair, and it did. Of course, Boston ended up losing that series, but he's pretty well known for that. But he had a pretty storied career with Chicago, right? I mean, at more games with Chicago, right?
Yeah, he played an awful lot more games with Chicago, about 2 seasons more. I guess maybe not 2 full seasons because his last year he only played 25 games. So really like a season and change more as a White Sox. And he had, his historic home runs, not in the playoffs, but in terms of his Hall of Fame accumulation. All of that happened while he was in Chicago. And I remember him just because of my age. I always think, if you tell me Carlton Fisk, I immediately put him in a White Sox uniform in my head. Even though he hit his big home run as a member of the Red Sox, he went to more All-Star games as a member of the Red Sox. He won the Rookie of the Year as a Red Sox. He's in the Hall of Fame as a Red Sox. So all of those moments of him in Boston, I said I missed them because I was really young when he was a Red Sox, and I remember him as a White Sox.
Yeah, I think the only thing he has the edge in terms of sort of compilation of accolades, be more all-star appearances when he was in Boston versus Chicago. So it breaks down to 7 versus 4. But you're right, he had a lot more games with Chicago, more years. He actually won no Silver Sluggers in Boston, won 3 Silver Slugger awards with Chicago. I actually was thinking a little bit about his career when I was doing a little bit of research on this. And he may have actually stayed in Boston his entire career if it wasn't for sort of a screw up by Boston owner / GM Haywood Sullivan, who was supposed to tender a contract to him before December 20th after the 1980 season. And they sent the letter out with the contract on the 22nd, and it turned into a big sort of legal fight. And the union argued that they missed the deadline and Fisk should become a free agent. And Boston did offer a contract to try to bring him back, but Fisk seemed pretty insulted by the contract offer that Boston provided. It was about a third less, and he also got some additional little perks from Chicago in terms of like professional services and things like that. Interestingly, Fred Lynn was also caught up in that debacle by the Red Sox GM, which was interesting, and that's sort of what landed him on the Angels. But do you think he would have stayed in Boston his whole career if they would have got that contract in?
I do, because he was a New Hampshire guy. He grew up rooting for the Red Sox. He said that was his dream, was to play for the Red Sox. The great question is, was it a mistake by Boston?
Right.
And I think Carlton Fisk to this day would say that he thinks they did it on purpose, as do a number of Boston conspiracy theorists. And we know conspiracy theorists are not always wrong. That Boston realized they had a PR nightmare on their hands, and maybe they just sent it out so that they would have a way out without saying, oh, we kicked him to the curb. They could be like, oh, it was a mess up, and now we're going to try and make things right, and he chose to leave. And I sort of feel like that might be sort of the way that it went, because he is, as much as the fans loved Carlton Fisk, he was a little bit divisive when it came to the clubhouse in both places that he played, but particularly in Boston. For his rookie year, he went after Reggie Smith and Carl Yastrzemski for not playing hard enough, and he went at him in the media, and Yastrzemski and Reggie Smith, I think, for years and years and years after, I don't think Reggie Smith ever forgave him. I think Carlton Fisk sort of came around to understand that he was sort of right, even if maybe he went around the breaching of the subject in the wrong way. But Carlton Fisk rubbed the clubhouse maybe not in the best way.
Yeah, it's interesting because Boston ownership in contemporary baseball doesn't have the best track record with how they treat some of their great players, and they seem to always sort of deflect, sort of blame. Like, they never seem to want to take blame. They always either put it on the player, or this came out a lot with Terry Francona, where they sort of put the blame on him when they sort of got him out of town. And I realize this is with Carlton Fisk, this happened 45 years ago, but it seems to be a pattern with Boston ownership and their management. And so you're right. Was it really a mistake, or was this just their way of sort of placating their fans and saying, well, we tried, and then they offered this paltry offer to kind of, which got even more insulting. And
speaking of Boston management, look how long it took them to integrate. Like, Boston's always been a little bit, but like I said, he didn't have a really great relationship. Bill Lee, remember Bill Lee? He said that Carlton Fisk has the personality of a dead carp in the Connecticut River. And Bill Lee, remember, got hurt in the big brawl that they had with the Yankees when Carlton Fisk and Lou Piniella got in a fight, and Bill Lee got hurt in that brawl and was never the same.
Yeah, so I wonder if there's a reason, the contract issue it kind of lends positively towards how people remember him, because he didn't leave Boston, at least on the surface, without getting into all the conspiracies and all of that. He didn't leave. He didn't want to leave. He didn't. He would have stayed, and I think that helps his image and his place in sort of Red Sox lore, and which is probably lends itself to overshadowing his Chicago years, in addition to everything else.
Yeah, it did. And when he got to Chicago, he didn't have much better of a relationship with their front office. He got into arguments with Jerry Reinsdorf, who was the owner, and Hawk Harrelson, who was the GM. And he was pissed off at Hawk Harrelson because Hawk Harrelson wanted to move him to the outfield and play a little at first base. And he said that I'm a catcher and I don't belong in the outfield. And he had problems with them. And Jerry Reinsdorf, when he wanted to finally get rid of Carlton Fisk, he waited till they were on the road and then released him when he was on the road and wouldn't let him in the clubhouse to say goodbye to the rest of the guys. But all of these problems with Carlton Fisk, when it came to whether it would be his teammates or his front office, had nothing to do with his relationship with the fans. And I think if you talk to Chicago fans and you talk to Boston fans, they love Carlton Fisk because he believed in playing hard, and he would get angry at anybody who didn't play the right way and didn't play hard. And he's a fan favorite, I think, to this day in both cities, where he does have both his numbers retired in Boston and in Chicago.
Yeah, great. Really interesting. It was nice going down sort of memory lane and looking at some of the, sort of his really the two sides of his career. But let's also talk about another player who had a pretty polarizing personality and played on a lot of teams, but is really remembered for a few teams. And I'm talking about Goose Gossage. And we're staying in Chicago, but this time with the Cubs. On August 6th, 1988, Goose Gossage, at age 36, and the Cubs were his fifth team at this time, joined Raleigh Fingers as the second closer to reach 300 saves. And a host of pitchers have surpassed that mark. But at the time, there was only two pitchers who got into that plateau. And Gossage actually played for a number of teams, including the Yankees, the White Sox, the Padres, the A's, the Pirates, the Rangers, the Mariners, and the Giants. And so I think if you ask most fans, they probably remember the Yankees, right? But I don't think a lot of people remember that he did a lot of stints, 1-year contracts with a number of teams. So do you think of Goose Gossage as a Yankee? I'm guessing you probably do.
I do, but I have to think about him as a Yankee. And that it is just because when I grew up and first remembered Goose Gossage, he was a Padre. Like, that's sort of where he was in my head. And then he had that run with them into the 1984 World Series. And he was on that absolutely ridiculous Padres team. And if maybe we ever have a chance to go down to 84 San Diego Padres, that was as close as you could possibly get to the 78 Yankees in the Bronx Zoo, which Goose Gossage was also on. He was sort of a purveyor of chaos wherever he went. But I think his best years were in New York. His most productive years were in New York. But it gets overlooked when you think about him in these 1-year stints of him maybe not being all that valuable or productive down the line. He was really productive in San Diego, particularly those first 2 years. And I don't think they make it to the World Series in '84 without Goose Gossage, those Padres.
Yeah, I totally agree. To me, I think of him as a Yankee first, and then I do remember him as a Padre. I actually think he should get a little more... maybe at the time that he played, there wasn't as much emphasis, and social media has really helped people follow player development. But the White Sox are really what helped develop him into sort of that really dominant arm that he had. And then eventually he goes over to Pittsburgh in 1977, and he has a big year. But the 1975 White Sox season, he led MLB with 26 saves, which doesn't seem like a huge number now, but that was a time where saves were really starting to become a thing, and the closer role hadn't really yet been, something that people put a lot of stock into. But the thing that blew me away about the 1975 season, he threw 141 innings over 62 games, no starts, because he did have some starts in his career, but 141 innings over 62 games. That's pretty crazy.
It is. And what I love about him is that he hates when people say that he is the godfather of the modern closer, because he hates the way that relief pitchers are being used now. And he's been very vocal about his disdain for the way that baseball offices run their bullpens, run their starters, the way that the commissioner has infiltrated himself into the game. His quote about Rob Manfred is, "A dead fish stinks from the head down." And he wants no part of being the guy that's responsible for the way that that closers are used, because his thing was, I'm a relief pitcher. I go in whenever there is a necessity for me to get guys out, whatever that situation is. And he wishes that there was more emphasis on that.
Yeah, in that Pittsburgh season where he really established himself as a late inning guy, in 17 of his 26 saves, he got at least 10 outs or more, which just shows sort of he's coming in and not just for one inning. But, when the term fireman is not really used that much now in baseball, but he was really sort of what you think of as the fireman who comes in and sort of puts out that fire, whether it's the ninth inning, eighth inning, even seventh inning.
Yeah, and one of the things that he points to is Mariano Rivera, and Mariano Rivera is the standard of the greatest closer. But if you look at it, and something he points out, Mariano Rivera played 881 games, and he inherited 308 runners. Goose Gossage pitched 965 games, and he inherited 832 runners. So that's a whole different ballgame of coming in. But he, like I said, he was a purveyor of chaos, which is why it's great that he was on the Padres and the Yankees for the Bronx Zoo and for 84. But did you know this about Goose Gossage, Jeff, speaking of chaos? He closed out the Bucky Dent home run game when they played game 163 against the Red Sox, and Bucky got his middle name that starts with F and ends with ING. He also was on the mound when George Brett hit the Pine Tar home run for Kansas City. He also was on the mound when Pete Rose had his very last major league at-bat. He struck out Pete Rose. And he was also on the mound the very first day that the Chicago White Sox wore shorts. How about that?
Wow.
For Goose Gossage.
That's pretty good. That is special. Those shorts were special.
Yeah, they only wore them 3 times. Game 1 of a doubleheader, and he was on the mound.
He was also he got the last out of the 1978 World Series as well, right? He closed that series out for the Yankees. So yeah, he's got his mark on baseball. I think he's so grumpy now. He's such a curmudgeon now, but it really fits his personality. He probably was a curmudgeon even before he, got into his elder years. But he was, fantastic. He's got a lot of recognition throughout the game. He places high as, third in MVP and Cy Young voting. So just a lot of, I think, he just shows how dominant he was during the era that he played in.
Yeah, he certainly was play the game the right way, respect the craft. And it's kind of funny that he and Carlton Fisk are back-to-back in our thing, because that was a real big thing for guys of that era, and they were particularly the gatekeepers of play the right way in the time that they played.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to our NFL history post. We don't always get them in the summer, but it's NFL Hall of Fame induction time. And first off, I want to congratulate Drew Brees, Larry Fitzgerald, Roger Craig, Adam Vinatieri, and Luke Kuechly on their induction into the Hall of Fame. Fantastic accomplishment. I don't think there was any doubt with any of those players. There's really some of the greatest of their generation. But we also had a post on August 7th where in 2010, John Randall, who played most of his career with the Vikings and then some with the Seahawks, was inducted. He was a dominant defender. He's 15th all-time in sacks, and he's recognized as one of the on the NFL's all 1990s team and top 100 team. I loved as you know, I love defense. Lawrence Taylor being my favorite player, but I love John Randall because just sort of watching it, just how good he was and how he really redefined his position. But would you consider him the sort of godfather of the modern day defensive tackles?
I do, because he was severely undersized. But if you look around the league now, the days of the fridge are pretty much long gone. And you don't have those 300-pound defensive tackles the way that you did in the 80s and in the 90s. And he was really the impetus that got defensive coordinators, to think about how to play in a different era, in a different world. And don't forget, he was chasing around, the Brett Favres of the world, as opposed to the more traditional stand in the pocket, Trent Dilfer types. That was kind of right when that change was happening, and you needed a more mobile, better defensive or different kind of defensive tackle, and he was that prototype.
Yeah, I really loved watching him because, for me, someone who's not a big individual, when I play sports, as you know, Clayton, I'm high energy and I throw my body out there, and what I don't have in skill, I try to make up for in effort. I feel like obviously John Randall had amazing skills, but he also had that energy and that effort, and they would say, the cliche, he never took a play off, but he really didn't. And I think what he figured out with his size is that, okay, I'm undersized, so I'm going to use my low center of gravity and figure out how I can use sort of my sort of undersized compared to, he was 6'1", 290 pounds. So that's, I'm not saying that he was small, but compared to sort of players of past eras in that position, he was, as you said, he was undersized. And so he learned how to use that to his advantage and really get through and thread the needle of the offensive line. When they moved him from sort of the edge to the inside, that really changed the game a lot for him, and he really maximized, what people would consider a deficiency or a weakness. Like I said, he used it to his advantage.
Yeah, he was undrafted out of Texas A&I Kingsville, but his brother went to Baylor, and he played for the Buccaneers. And his brother got him a tryout with the Buccaneers at their mini camp right after the draft. And the Buccaneers didn't want anything to do with him because he was too small. And he went to another, I think he was at the Falcons. I could be wrong. It might have been somebody else. And then he ended up in Minnesota, and they really liked his motor in Minnesota. And the coach by the name of John Tierlink, who was their defensive line coach, really liked him. But he also knew that he was too small, and he told him, he said, all right, when we break after our mini camp before fall camp, he's like, if you can get to 250, then you can come and we'll look at you again in camp. So he got there, and he was like 246 when he got to camp. And so he took a chain and a big padlock, and he hid it underneath his sweatsuit to get up to 251 on the scale so that they would let him stay and play. And he ended up being in camp, and they decided to keep him as a defensive end special teams guy. But it really wasn't until 2 years later with Dennis Green, and he really credits Dennis Green and John Tierlink for having the vision to create something with him. And then he always says Randall McDaniel, who was the Hall of Fame offensive guard that he went against every day, was really key in developing his skill set as a defensive tackle.
Yeah, and he wasn't afraid of contact. He really embraced contact. He had not the same player, but I think probably the most famous sort of high energy, always got your motor running is probably Ray Lewis, right? I think that's probably a lot of fans will remember that about Ray Lewis. Obviously, two different positions and two different types of players, but he really had that energy and that drive that he brought every play, every game. And I think that's that's how he made up for his lack of size, and that's what he knew he needed to do every day until it became just a habit for him.
Yeah, it wasn't just his skill set and his relentless motor, but he was really smart. And he just sort of brought a new sort of intellectualism to the defensive tackle position. And one of the things that really shows that is he had 135 and a half sacks, Jeff, over his career, right? And he had 54 of those sacks on third down, which is, you would expect you'd have a lot of sacks on third down, right? It's an obvious passing situation. You're going to get a mismatch on the sub package a lot of times. So that makes sense. But he had, remember, 54 on third down. He had 53 on first down. And first down's a read and react down.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff can go on first down. And he had one less sack in his career on first down than he did on third down. Yeah. It's incredible.
Yeah, it really was incredible. And I think nowadays, for fans that have been following football maybe for the last, 20 years, we think of like Warren Sapp and Aaron Donald, some contemporaries now, but they are sort of the legacy of John Randall, because they are now a lot more reflective of that position than maybe someone like Mean Joe Green that was more common prior to John Randall's time. So I think going back to what we said about him being the godfather, he really did revolutionize that position and showed that certain type of player with certain build and the speed and the IQ and the ability to sort of use their low center of gravity, use their quick hands. Mm-hmm. All of that is now something that I think teams really look for in those positions.
Right, and it goes back to something that I always said about people that are first and seconds, right? It didn't take seeing John Randall for a bunch of undersized guys to think that they could play defensive tackle, right? It didn't see them seeing themselves. It took coaches seeing how effective it was, who are the gatekeepers of who gets to play in the game, that owners and GMs and defensive coordinators saw what was possible, that made way for other players to come along after him and really change how the defensive line is structured and looked at. And he has made a place for a number of guys like him since he's retired.
Okay, let's move on and talk about football or soccer. We just talked about football. And actually another player that benefited from someone seeing what that player was like and knowing what they could do and giving them an opportunity was Thierry Henry. And so on August 3rd, 1999, Arsenal paid 11 million sterling to Juventus. Sorry, my accent's off there. For French striker Henry. He started out slow that year, but later he finished strong. He had 17 goals in the final 23 Premiership matches, and he led the Gunners to a second place finish. They'd win the Premiership twice during his tenure, in the 2001-2002 season, and then the 2003-2004 season. But he has a number of other accolades, and his time with Arsenal was some of the best soccer any player has enjoyed. But all of it sort of came to being when he had started out in Monaco, and then Arsene Wenger saw him in Monaco, and then now with Arsenal brought him over and gave him that opportunity, right?
Yeah, he was with Arsene Wenger in Monaco at their academy when he was a teenager. And then he ended up signing with Juventus in the Italian Serie A. And Juventus used him as a winger, and which was really not his position. That was really less of what he naturally did well. But the thing that he did learn how to do while he was there was he learned a lot of how to facilitate and how to pass, and really became a great assist player as a winger. But he didn't score a whole lot, and he had 3 goals with Juventus. And Arsene Wenger, who remembered him and knew him from Monaco, wanted him desperately at Arsenal because he wanted to turn him into a striker, because he had all of the offensive skill with the speed and the size at 6'2", when a lot of strikers are smaller. You think about Messi or Ronaldo; these are smaller individuals that typically play in the striker role. And he wanted a guy with all that skill and all that size in Thierry Henry, and he wanted to bring him over and turn him into a striker. And as you said, it was slow going for the first 7 or 8 games. I don't think he scored until the 9th game. And there was kind of a lot of I can't believe we paid all this money for this guy. until he got comfortable in his role, and then the rest is history. He just took over the Premiership for the time that he was at Arsenal.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting because in hindsight, everyone looks back at great players, and we talked about this a little bit with Michael Jordan, where for first part of Michael Jordan's career, he wasn't Michael Jordan that we all know. Now everyone was questioning, the questions that followed him sort of out of high school and into college and then into the pros. Not that he wasn't good, but not at the level that we all regard Michael Jordan now. Now everyone looks back and says, oh yeah, Michael Jordan, he was great. And I think the same thing with Henry, where Juventus, his stock was down, right? Everyone was saying, oh yeah, he started out great in Monaco, but he wasn't, he's not going to turn into like a spectacular player. But it took someone who believed in him and knew his skill set and was familiar with his game and saw that he was being misused to, like you said, turn him into the striker, and not really even a striker like, where it's a little more stationary. He could really move to the outside, and then come back in and use his speed and agility to really create a lot of chaos and problems for opposing defenses.
Yeah, he had that rare combination of speed and balance, and that his left foot was just as good as his right foot. And so he could go around you, and if for some reason he couldn't go around you, he could bang one from 25 yards out. That was not a problem from him either. Alan Shearer, who used to play against him quite a bit in the Premiership, said that not only is he a great goal scorer, he's a scorer of great goals, which means that he didn't just sort of slog in and rebound or a header off of the corner kick, but he made highlight reels plays consistently, which is really what captured the imagination of the Arsenal fan base, who were skeptical upon his first arrival.
Yeah, he had that trademark curl sort of strike into the far corner of the goal, right, where he could sort of arch the ball around, and it was almost impossible to defend. But he was also part of the 2003 to 2004 season. The Arsenal team, nicknamed the Invincibles, they were unbeaten that year, and he really anchored that team. He brought another dimension to those offenses and just made everyone around him so much better.
Yeah, the Invincibles with Robert Perez and Ashley Cole, and Patrick Vieira was there as well, who was a teammate of his on the French national team. And that's another thing with Arsenal. They had a lot of guys that had come through the French national team that were there while he was there. So not just Patrick Vieira, but Ian Wright and Gilles Grimandi. He was at Arsenal, and Emmanuel Petit. So he had a number of players that he sort of had felt comfortable with, and he had developed relationships with on the French national team, and that just translated to his time at Arsenal.
Yeah, and he was also a major part of France winning the World Cup in, 1998? 98. So that just added to his legacy, and that's something that a lot of great players haven't been able to capture. But he really has the full, complete resume where, wherever he went, he was successful, or he had people who knew that he could be successful if he was put into the right environment. And I think that speaks really well for any athlete who, you have people who really recognize when your skills are being wasted and they want to move you into a role where you can succeed.
Yeah, and a lot of people have said, he's the Michael Jordan of soccer. And I would say no, he's the Kobe Bryant of soccer, because his offense was parallel to none, but it was really, you think about Kobe and the Mamba mentality, and that's the way it was with Thierry Henry, that he was the first one in, he was the last one out, and you better work as hard as he does. And he had that sort of confidence with a little bit of arrogance, but not necessarily in a bad way. But they always said to him, they asked him, what do you want people to do? And he said, I want people to respect me every time that I'm out on the pitch. And they said, well, who do you respect? And he said, no one. I believe in me. And that's a very Kobe Bryant. Who do you respect? No one.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on. We had a few more history posts that we want to get into, and we had two for the Olympics, although different events and different Olympics, but they were both about women's sports. And so it was a couple of firsts, and we had a post on August 5th about the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, and it was where Joan Benoit of the United States beat a field of 50 runners to win the inaugural women's marathon event. She beat defending champion Greta Weitz of Norway. Although the men's marathon had been around since the first Olympics in 1896, it took until 1984 to have the women's event. And then on August 4th, the day before, we posted about a more recent Olympics, the Tokyo Olympics, which actually was supposed to be in 2020, but due to the pandemic, it got bumped to 2021. Japan went 1-2 in the first ever women's skateboarding event. Sakura Yosozumi took gold, and her teammate Kokona Hiraki came in second, and Great Britain's Sky Brown rounded out the podium with bronze. So two different women's events, but first for the Olympics.
Yeah, first for the Olympics.
And I guess I wanted to add, what was that?
Go ahead. I thought you were going to go ahead.
Sorry. Oh, I just wanted to say, how I want to start with marathon because I know you're a big fan of marathon. So how significant was it for the Olympics to add women's marathon in 1984?
It was huge because this is an event that was created for the Olympics. It was never existed in the history of mankind until the 1896 Olympics, and it has been contested at every Olympics since, but it was only ever for men up until 1984. Even though women's marathon had been running for a number of years in Boston and in New York and along the professional marathon scene, it had never been in the Olympics. And not just was marathon not in the Olympics, but the longest race for women in track and field was 1,500 meters. Up until 1984, and they added the 3,000 meters, not the steeplechase, this is the straight flat 3,000, and the marathon. And since then, it has grown that the women have a full track program now in the Olympics. They run the 3,000 meter steeplechase just like the men. They run the 5,000, the 10,000, and the marathon. So this was the beginning of that. And Joan Benoit is one of the most seminal figures in American running, and a lot of people might know her now as Joan Benoit Samuelson, but this was pre-marriage. But she was sort of the first real star of the women's marathon as it was starting to grow. It was her and Greta Weitz; those were the two that everyone had their eye on. And the thing was, they had never run against each other in a marathon before. And so this was going to be the first time that we finally have that old World Series, right, before the interleague play. Yeah. Like, what would happen if the American League, what would happen if the Mets and the Yankees played? Well, we never know. And this was that moment in women's marathon that the two of them finally found themselves on the same start line, and they didn't disappoint. They went 1-2.
Okay, well, first I called her Benoit just because I guess I still have French in my head after talking.
You got Thierry Henry on the brain.
Exactly. Okay, Benoit. But she actually was a pretty fairly well-known marathon runner leading up to the Olympics, right? And she won the 1979 Boston Marathon while still a senior at Bowdoin College. And she set an American record winning that marathon. I think the interesting thing about those Olympics and reading about these various events that they felt, we can't have women compete in these events. And they had a variety of different reasons, such as, misguided medical rationale about damage to women's reproductive systems or health or bodies. And it just shows how, some of these approaches by these international bodies are still so archaic at times. I mean, I know this is, still, 40 years ago. But it just shows that, that still feels a lot more recent than some of these decisions that had been made, where it finally took them all that time to finally decide, okay, well, I guess it's okay to let women run marathons. So I found that pretty interesting.
There was a little bit of that. There's also, and that's sort of the fun part for people to latch onto of saying that argument, which is certainly it's valid, Jeff. I'm not saying it's not valid. But another part of the problem on the women's side with some of the events is that there is a lack of participation in certain sports, that you need to get to a threshold to be able to have a competition. And we saw this with women's ski jumping when it was trying to get into the Olympics. And they were like, why can't they have women's ski jumping? Women can ski jump. And clearly they can. The problem is that you didn't have enough participation to be able to field a full event safely, in that, there were only, 10 or 12 women in the world at one point that were able to jump off of the normal hill. And when the consequence of not being able to do it is paralysis and death, like, you kind of need to make sure that you have enough that participation from a young enough age. And so it takes a while for that to grow. And that's something where these pro marathons were really valuable in the New York City Marathon and the Boston Marathon and their admission of women, that you were able to finally grow enough people that could run a competitive time against one another in order to be able to have these events. And I think having it in the United States, and the U.S. was a real big proponent of, we want as many women's sports as possible. The U.S. is the leader worldwide in the promotion of women's sports. That it being in Los Angeles and it being in the United States, and it having the IAAF have to look to USA Track and Field for help at this event, that was really a precursor and a push in order to have an event like the marathon. And the thing that's funny about it, Jeff, is there's always that talk about, okay, could women's bodies handle it? And then, I don't know if you remember, but there was the Swiss runner in this event, Gabrielle Anderson Schiess, who got dehydrated and was sort of like waffling around the last lap. And those pictures sort of went all over the world. And there was a thought initially like, oh, well, this is going to set everything back because this is our greatest fear. But it did the actual opposite because of her perseverance and her willingness to want to finish that race, and how much people admired her for fighting through that to the end, that it had the complete opposite effect. And it was an empowerment moment instead of a detriment moment.
I wondered, just in listening to what you were saying, because I had a couple notes here about ski jump, and FIS President Gianfranco Casper had noted about ski jumping that he used this sort of medical justification about, didn't seem medically appropriate, and he cited some, loose criteria from some medical associations, things like that. But it was pretty flimsy argument. And I wondered if it's sometimes easier for some of these organizations to sort of give that reason rather than having to say we just don't have enough competitive women in the world because the sport hasn't really generated that level of sport. And so they don't want to come out and say that, so they give some of these other reasons to sort of deflect from those rationales when maybe their decision is a little bit of both. But do you think that sometimes those justifications are given in place?
Yeah, the one thing that organizations can always do is hide behind athlete safety, because it's really hard to argue against athlete safety, and that can buy you time. But that was one of the things that that the FIS and that at least people around the ski jumping world were very cognizant of, is that there just weren't enough competitors. And you also have to go through a protocol with the Olympics where you have to hold, I think it's 2 successful world championships. So that you need to have these events leading up to an Olympic Games before you can put something on the program that take a couple of Olympic cycles in order to meet the criteria. And that's something that we saw with skateboarding, that skateboarding had to create a world championships, and it had to create a governing body, because skateboard was something that didn't really exist as a sport much beyond what they were kind of doing at the X Games, and there was sort of a loose affiliation, but there was no governing body in order to work with the IOC to create it as an Olympic sport. So that skateboarding, which we saw in 2021, had to go through all of those processes as well.
Yeah, and that actually brings us to Sakura Yosuzumi, who took Japanese gold in that Tokyo Olympics. And I thought it was an interesting point that I read where they're sometimes a little hesitant to get the Olympics involved in some of these emerging sports because sports need sort of that creativity and sort of freedom to grow and sort of develop their rules, develop their styles, and the IOC has a very defined sort of structure and construct around all the sports, and that could actually sort of handcuff a sport like skateboarding that is fairly new. Do you think there's a danger for some of these new sports when it's still sort of an emerging sport and you get this big international body coming in and saying this is what you have to follow? Because everyone's going to then try to adjust their scoring so it conforms with what the IOC says.
Right, and there also has to be a buy-in. And I remember when freestyle snowboarding and freestyle skiing first came to the Winter Olympics. And there was a big pushback from the athletes because they were like, wait, you came to us. Like, we're not petitioning to be a part of the Olympics. We've got our thing, when it comes to drug testing and equipment and, all of these, what these parameters of the sport are, that this governing body is now trying to say, okay, well, we need all these athletes. And how do we get these surfers on board for surfing at the Olympics when they're used to a certain way, and now we're going to tell them it's a different way? And so there's been more of a willingness to accommodate the sort of structure of these emerging sports in order to get them onto the program, because these sports have realized that they sort of have the leverage, because the IOC really wants some of these newer sports in a way that they didn't in the past, where they were very hesitant in the past. But now it's to the point where each Olympics has an opportunity to have sports come on to debut, and not just in a demonstration way like it used to be back in the 70s or 80s, but in a real meaningful way. We saw karate in 2020. It was an Olympic sport, and then it was gone. We saw breaking in Paris. It was gone. Now, we're going to have flag football in the United States because that's something that's culturally significant in the United States, the way that breaking was culturally significant in France. We'll see something different when we get to Australia. So they've had to really sort of rework their framework of what does it mean to be an Olympic sport, and how do we work with these new governing bodies?
Yeah, I was going to mention breaking. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that as an Olympic event. 'Cause I always love hearing. You always have such an interesting outlook on many different things, especially Olympics.
It did not resonate with me. And I get the argument that it's no different than figure skating, or it's no different than synchronized swimming, that it's just a different form of that. I did not find it interesting to me. It did not resonate with me as a sport. I didn't feel like it necessarily maybe had enough history of competition in order for them to come up with a really interesting or compelling way to do the competition. So I didn't care much for the format of it. So for me, it was a bust. But I don't fault them for trying it, or I don't fault people for liking it. It just didn't resonate with me. In the same way that, honestly, like sport climbing doesn't resonate with me, but I get it. I get why people like it. It's just not necessarily for me. But I do like that they're trying new sports, and that you're not beholden. Just because we had it last time doesn't mean we have to have it this time. But I would like to see baseball and softball on the permanent program.
Yeah, the everyone made fun of race walking. But actually, as you probably know, that's actually a pretty old sport. It was very popular in the 19th century and early 20th century. They had it in the 1904 and 1908 Olympics, and they brought it back for 2024. But it used to be called pedestrianism or race walking. I think speed walking, sometimes people call it. So it's interesting because I think sometimes people forget that some sports that fall out of national spotlight, they've been around for a long time.
Yeah, maybe one day they'll bring back tug of war from the 1904 Olympics. But they did, Jeff. They are bringing back obstacle course, but it's part of the modern pentathlon. They're replacing the equestrian event in modern pentathlon with a sort of American Ninja Warrior obstacle course, because the cost of doing equestrian and shipping the horses all the way around the world in the quarantines was getting too much for the federation to bear. So they've replaced that portion of the of one of the 5 events in the pentathlon with the obstacle course, which is a return to, I believe they had the obstacle course in the 1904 games as well. Could be wrong about that, but I think they did.
I just don't want them to bring competitive eating. That's the only thing I don't want to see.
No. Yeah, no.
Okay, well, let's move on. We had one final post to talk about, and we just want to touch briefly on this. It's just kind of a really interesting part of NASCAR history. And we posted on August 9th, back in 1959, Joe Lee Johnson, driving a 1957 Chevy convertible, won the NASCAR Nashville 300. This was one of his 2 Cup Series wins, and it was part of the convertible division series, which ended after the season. And then there was some other standalone races, and those all ceased by 1962. I have to admit, I love the image of convertibles flying around the racetrack.
I do too. And I specifically, I specifically like the idea of a 57 Chevy, twirling around. But you're right, the safety issue is a bit of a problem.
And what would Jackie Stewart say?
Oh, Jackie Stewart would not approve. Although Jackie Stewart was in those Formula One cars that had open tops. They were very much like convertibles, but we've seen a real concerted effort from all of racing to get rid of those open tops, even if they have an open top, and to provide some manner of protection. We saw that IndyCar went to an aero screen in 2020 that sort of wraps around, and then Formula One has this sort of halo that can take up to 12 tons of pressure coming down on it to protect these drivers because of flying debris. And we've all seen the NASCAR crashes into the fence at Talladega, especially the super speedways, and just how dangerous all that flying debris can be, which is unfortunate that we had to lose the convertibles. Although, Jeff, I'm not sure that you could get enough aerodynamics and downforce on a convertible to get it to go 200 miles an hour.
Yeah. Speaking of just sort of safety and tragedy, that actually led to Joe Lee Johnson's career ending. Not that he was in an accident, but there was a pretty tragic accident at the 1960 Southern 500, known as a pit road tragedy. Killed members of the crew out there. It was, I think, a NASCAR official was killed. It was a pretty horrific incident, and he said after that accident, his heart wasn't in racing anymore, just sort of kind of gave it all up. But part of this too was a push by U.S. automakers to really sell convertibles. Almost every U.S. automaker, if not all of them, had some kind of convertible, and they were really trying to sell them to the younger generation. And I think what we kind of now think of as sort of classic 1960s sort of the Beach Boys and all of that car culture from that era. And so really NASCAR was helping these manufacturers by promoting these races that everyone could sort of kind of rally around.
Yeah, and it's a shame, really, that the Joe Lee Johnson's career sort of cut short, because he won the World 600, which is now everybody knows as the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway, which is one of the biggest races on the calendar. And he also was the Petty killer, Jeff, because not only in this race that he beat Lee Petty, but he also beat Richard Petty, and he won the convertible division by beating Bob Wellborn. And I don't know if you know this or not, but Bob Wellborn used to drive for Julian Petty, who was Lee Petty's brother and Richard Petty's uncle. And he was a car mechanic, and he was a car owner, builder. And he had Junior Johnson and Joe Weatherly and Rex White and Dave Pearson all drove for him. And all of those guys are in the Hall of Fame. And Joe Lee Johnson knocked them off regularly, the Petty family. So good on you, Joe Lee Johnson, to beat the Petties.
Yeah, he has a short but really interesting career and really at the sort of part of a lot of different historical milestones for NASCAR. So we're going to call it there, Clayton.
All right.
We'll ride off into the sunset after this. I just want to remind everyone out there, follow us on all the socials. You can find us on Blue Sky, Instagram, Substack, X, and YouTube. And for Facebook, you can find us at Sports and Leisure. At all the other sites, we're at Sports History SL. That's Sports History, the letter S, the letter L. Like our posts, share the knowledge, and we'll see you next week, Clayton.
See you next week.